Everyone, there we go. Participants will be muted, and we ask if you can mute yourselves if you aren't already for the duration of the webinar, as well as your cameras be turned off, just out of respect for the presentation. It can be distracting. Submitting any questions you have during the presentation of the chat box is what we would request. And we will have time for questions at the end of the webinar, probably around 15 minutes of 8. And Bria and I will help sift through those for Forrest to answer. You will receive an evaluation form after this, so you can share your feedback on the presentation, some future ideas or topics for us to maybe go off of, find some professionals to present on, and you'll receive an email with links to the webinar recording to watch again and share to others as well. So New Hampshire Lakes, we're a nonprofit organization that is the voice for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. And our mission is to restore and preserve the health of those lakes. We have several departments. So we have our advocacy program, which you can sign up for advocacy alerts as the upcoming session begins. We also have a link on our website under our advocacy tab to track our matrix of bills, our lake-friendly bills, or our lake bills that we are tracking, and want you guys to be aware of. We also have a couple of conservation programs. We have the Lake Host program to teach you how to clean, drain, and dry your boat for the limit of spread of aquatic invasive species. And our Lake Smart program to help you, give you some property tours and some lake-friendly living suggestions to help protect our lakes. We also have our outreach like this kind of event right here. And we want to let people know what we're up to and what's going on in the world and what's going on in New Hampshire right now. So for you to stay up to date. So you can become a supporter. It's easy. With your gift, you can join a growing community for people like you who care passionately about New Hampshire's lakes. Your host this evening, so I'm Samantha. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for New Hampshire Lakes, and I have Bria with me co-hosting and again, helping sift through your questions. I'm the Director of Programs. And our presenter, we have Forrest Bell, the owner and CEO of FB Environmental Associates. And with that, I will unshare my screen so Forrest can share his, and we can get started on the presentation.
That sounds so good. Before I share my screen, yeah, thank you, Sam and Bria, and kudos to New Hampshire Lakes for all you guys do. I follow what you do very carefully, and it's so important. So thank you for that. And I don't know if you can read it, but behind me is a little Robert Frost saying, my goal in life is to unite my avocation with my vocation as my two eyes make one in sight. So I'm saying that because I'm very fortunate to do the work that I do. I love the outdoors. I've loved water resources since I was a child, and how great is it that every day, literally of my life, I am, doing something to help protect our natural resources. So with that, I will share my screen. All right, all good? All good. So yeah, the title of my presentation is Watershed Management Planning for Your Lake. I have 35 slides I'll go through, and I'll tell you now that the last slide, number 35, before the question slide, I'm going to talk about funding. So I'm going to pause there for a bit. So as I go through this, you're going to be thinking, how much does this cost and how do we get one? But I'll go over that for sure. So hang in there. So a little about me and us, just a few slides for an introduction is it's a pretty neat story. FB Environmental Associates started, in my basement with kids running around upstairs, and literally got a call from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection asking to help them assess lakes in Maine. And that was back in 2001, so almost 25 years ago. And that's all I did for the first 6 or 7 years of business, is just assess lakes and and put these phosphorus control action plans together. So a lot of experience right from the beginning. I like to say we work where science meets civics. So I've always felt that there's a gap there. We have science, we have policy, and we really need to bridge that gap. And that's a lot of the work we do, is to take sometimes often complex science and translating it in such a way that it can inform really good policy. So similar to what New Hampshire Lakes does, and many people in our sector do, but it's a strong part of our mission. We work throughout New England, but most of our lake work is in New Hampshire. So this is an appropriate audience, and offices in Dover, New Hampshire, where I'm sitting right now, and also Portland, Maine. And I also, some of you, I'm sure, know Laura Deemer. CLM stands for Certified Lake Manager. I think she's one of only a couple in New Hampshire and a handful in New England. And she's not on the call. She's at a meeting tonight, but she does so much work for New Hampshire Lakes and is a big part of what we do. And these are just some pictures. I mentioned uniting our vocation with avocation. So look at all the smiling faces. That's me down in the lower right doing a salamander survey. So we get to do really cool and fun work. We have 20 of us right now helping out in the two states. And we've conducted assessments for, as you can see, over 1,000 water bodies and a whole bunch of watershed plans, I think 50 or 60 to date. So it's a big part of what we do. We work to make each one better than the last one we've done. And what's really been interesting is gaining the knowledge of comparing and contrasting. So working in many different water bodies of all shapes, all sizes, with all sorts of different problems to solve, and thousands of people just like yourselves. Okay, so enough about me and us. Let's talk about the subject. So why do we need watershed plans? And this is kind of the very basic graphic. I'm going to just do some background. I think it's always good to start from ground zero to kind of re-educate all of us. But I always, a watershed is often like a bowl, if you kind of could picture it, and everything that runs down the side of the bowl is running into your lake or a river or an estuary. And we all live in a watershed, right? So watershed plans are really important. In New Zealand, a lot of the political boundaries are based on watershed boundaries. A little known fact, I think, and it would make our job so much easier because we're often dealing with regulations, almost always for multiple municipalities, but often multiple states and sometimes even multiple countries, Canada and the United States. So that's the water cycle, which I'm sure you know a bit about. Everything's a cycle, everything's moving, and your lake is a big part of that cycle. I always like to show this visual, which is an aerial photo of Half Moon Lake, where we've done some work, so you can kind of, even though it's not quite a bowl in this picture, you can really get a sense of, even if you only have a little bit of slope, things are really, making their way down into the lake. And, more about that as I move on through these slides. And again, here's kind of the concept of we all live in a watershed. You can see up at the top of your screen is Lake Winnipesaukee, and Winnisquam is to the southwest of that, and you can see all these sub-watersheds as we call them. And it's pretty interesting because it's much easier, I think, to environmentally manage a smaller area than a larger area. Lake Winnipesaukee is complicated, right? There's a lot of those sub-watersheds up at the top of the screen. And in that case, the Lake Winnipesaukee Alliance has done watershed plans for all those sub-watersheds at this point. So as I mentioned, they don't know municipal or state boundaries. Okay, so I won't throw too many trivia words at you, but cultural eutrophication is a good one to remember. So, eutrophication, as many of you probably know, it's it's how lakes over time become, the word we use in the science world is more productive, but the visuals show that. So in a ligotrophic lake, I always think of Lake Tahoe. If you've been there or seen pictures of it in California and Nevada, it's big, it's deep, it's clear. There's not a lot of plant life. You have a lot of, trout and salmon, depending on the fishery there. Mesotrophic. A lot of our lakes in New Hampshire fall under mesotrophic, and that's, as you can see, kind of the middle ground to eutrophic. And eutrophic is really when you have a lot of sediment that's come and filled in your lake, and you have lots of weeds growing, and it's generally a bit warmer. So the message on this slide is not to teach you about eutrophication necessarily, but to show you that this is a natural process that takes place over thousands of years. And cultural eutrophication is the human influence on this natural process. Okay, so because of our development, because we love our lakes, we love them too much, and we have this increased nutrient input. And that nutrient input is really accelerating and exacerbating that move to eutrophic. So we want to slow down that cycle if we can, because all lakes are different, but a lot of people would prefer a lake that's not really mucky and weedy and has cyanobacteria blooms. More on that in a second. So lake ecosystems reflect a balance of inputs and outputs of material and energy that determines their water quality. And this slide is showing, what your lake looked like maybe 500 years ago. And in the lake management world, this is really important to us, and it's an important message to know that that process that I just talked about was happening really slowly in this case. And what do we have? We have fish and wildlife, and the whole food chain and the food web is kind of cranking along and doing well. But as I mentioned, sometimes we love our lakes too much. And, again, we have our boats, we like to recreate, we like to build our homes, we like to have our water views. We add different sources of power. We farm the land, as you can see on the left side of the screen. So again, we're trying to find the balance in watershed management and lake management between development and safe development and water quality protection and protecting the resource that we all love so much. So cyanobacteria is the buzzword. It has been for at least 1 decade, probably 2 or 3 decades. And these cyanobacteria are natural, but they are increasing the counts of cyanobacteria, and the frequency of blooms is increasing as our waters warm, as our temperatures change. So it's happening more in other parts of our country, but really, again, in the last decade, moving more into New Hampshire. And this is sort of the battle we're fighting. And the picture on the right is it's a scary picture, but it's one of my favorite pictures to illustrate what cyanobacteria can do and look like. So that's obviously an aerial photograph. That's Blackie Cove in Lake Winnipesaukee. And what's off the screen to the right is Lake Kanesatka. So an entirely different lake, I think a mile or so away. The bloom flowed through the outlet of that lake and into Lake Winnipesaukee. So what started as just a Lake Kanesatka issue, and that's in Moultonborough, New Hampshire, became something much greater. And Lake Winnipesaukee, which is, as you just learned, the biggest lake actually in New Hampshire. So really interesting to see, a lot of the pollutants we deal with, you can't see, they're not visual, but these blooms of cyanobacteria, which are fed by pollutants, you can see, and you need to keep an eye out. And again, the state of New Hampshire is doing a really fantastic job, in my humble opinion, on monitoring these. So the cause, I mean, the main cause, and what we're going to talk about today, and what these watershed plans are usually focused on, is phosphorus. So phosphorus is a limiting nutrient in our systems, and it's basically, again, phosphorus is a element number 15. It's in the periodic table of elements. Phosphorus is in our bodies, it's in our atmosphere, it's really in our soil, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the phosphorus really feeds the cyanobacteria. So in essence, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like fertilizing the lake. Even just soil erosion that's flowing in, and you add sunlight, you add warmer temperatures, and you start to see these blooms occur. So getting a little bit more into watershed planning, this is an interesting study. On the left, that steel curtain was placed in an experimental lake in Canada in, I think, the late 1960s. And there was phosphorus added to one side of that curtain and not to the other side. And you can guess which one has the phosphorus. It's the lower side of that curtain. So again, it's a visual to see how these blooms happen. And in that picture I showed with the loons and the fish and the forested background, kind of like the trees in the picture here, you don't have a lot of phosphorus flowing off the land into your lake. But when you develop it, this is roughly speaking, it's more of a gross estimate, but you're usually looking at around 10 times the amount of phosphorus from a natural setting, from a developed setting, as opposed to a natural setting. I mentioned soil erosion, right? And if you've probably all seen soil erosion before, especially if you have gravel roads on a lake in New Hampshire. So our soil has a good deal of phosphorus in it, and you might know this because if you're fertilizing your lawn, that's one of the, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus are the nutrients that you're adding to your fertilizer. We often don't need that in New Hampshire because, again, there is a lot of natural phosphorus. But the point of these slides, and part of the topic is understanding if you need a watershed plan. If you have a lot of sites or even a handful of sites like this in your watershed, it most likely is contributing to the degradation of your lake. And we like to call it, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Like one of these sites can definitely have an impact, but if you have 500 or 1,000 of these sites, you literally have tons of soil, and we often measure them in dump truck loads each year, what's flowing into your lake. And with that soil, the phosphorus is attached and starting to feed that cyanobacteria. So it's not just soil erosion, there are other sources as well. And again, a lot of you are familiar with these, agriculture, pet waste, fertilizing lawns, septic systems I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, but that could be a whole nother topic, right? Because a lot of what's happening you can't see. And geese, those pesky Canadian geese, really hard to deal with. They love the close cut grass, and their feces is a high source of phosphorus. So we actually, when we're doing our watershed plans, we're actually trying to count the geese and get an estimate of the geese. And again, so the challenge is with cyanobacteria, it's a human health threat, and it's also a threat to our pets. There is a well-known researcher, Dr. Jim Haney at the University of New Hampshire, that has been studying for decades the link between ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and cyanobacteria. So it's not something we can take lightly. And so again, a lot of the work that we need to do is to help understand and also treat the issues that are contributing to these cyanobacteria blooms. Okay, so that's the intro, and now I'm going to get into a watershed plan. So who needs a watershed plan? In my opinion, it's everybody, and that's not just because I'm a consultant. That's because whether your lake is impaired and has problems that you need to fix, that's one set. But even if you have a pristine lake that you want to protect for the generations to come, that is also a very good reason to have a watershed plan. So we've gotten to work, as I mentioned, on all sorts from the pristine lake, but we often see lakes that already have problems. The lake's on fire. You have these blooms, or you've had more occurrences of the blooms. So I'm going to go into some detail on what's in the plan, but the kind of the key factors are it identifies the sources. You set a water quality goal. So if your lake is at 12 parts per billion average phosphorus levels, and you want to get it down to 10, or you want to maintain it at 12, that's an example of a goal. And it sounds very simple, but it's really, it's very complicated to get to a water quality goal. And it's oftentimes, excuse me, a community decision um, with our recommendation and the state of New Hampshire's recommendation and other stakeholders. And then finally, and just as importantly, it's what are you going to do? So their plans are not helpful if they sit on the shelf and nothing ever happens with them. We're really only interested in helping with plans where the actions are prioritized and there's a really motivated group that is going to implement the plan and do what's needed to be done. Those are the favorite stories, right? The soup to nuts, from assessment to implementation to improving water quality, and we need more of those stories. We absolutely do. So this is taking that last slide and putting it in a little more detail. So again, just like the water cycle, right? It's a cycle, the watershed planning cycle. You want to build the public support. You want to complete the field surveys, the boots on the ground work, inventory the watershed. Where are the problems? Then you want to define those problems. You want to set the goals and develop solutions, and then obviously writing the plan, the written science, and the action plan of how you're going to do it, who's going to do it, how much is it going to cost, and what's a good time to get it done by. Should you get the work done in 2 years? Can you do it in 10 years? Obviously, funding plays a part of that. And then applying for grants, which I'll talk about on my last slide, and evaluate regularly. And in New Hampshire and all of New England, it's recommended that you update a plan every 10 years or so. Things change a lot. I can't tell you how different the state of our lakes are now. I guess I can tell you they're very different than they were 10 years ago. Development has increased. The cyanobacteria blooms have increased. So we're seeing a lot, and there's oftentimes a transition in people that are leading this work and in charge. So that's another good reason to keep the cycle going. Okay, so in a little bit more detail, the public process is really important. So I'll go ahead and give you some sticker shock. A watershed plan generally costs 75 to 100,000 to produce. And that sounds like a lot of money. It is. It takes a year to 18 months, so it's a lot of time, and often about 1,000 hours or so of labor that goes in. Groups can fund the plans in phases, and there's lots of grants to help do the plans. So I hope I didn't scare you away yet, but one of the reasons that it costs a fair amount to do these plans is that a good plan is one that has a lot of stakeholder support and backing and participation. So again, if you want to hire a consultant, do the science and give us a plan, that might work for some people, but that's not what we've learned is the best way to do it because it's really you folks, right? It's the citizens of the watershed, it's the municipalities, it's the nonprofit groups, it's the businesses, it's all of the stakeholders that need to be engaged. So a good watershed plan, in my opinion, and I know in many others' opinions as well, has a really high level public engagement program so that the stewards of the lake can will know what to do and be part of the process and really understand the science and the recommendations. So that these pictures are all from watershed planning public meetings with folks like yourself. Then a big part of it, right? So your lake, you have data, right? The state of New Hampshire's most likely been collecting data. Some volunteers might have been collecting data. You might have hired outside contractors to collect the data. But a big part of the plan is taking all those data, organizing them, right? They often come to us in a kind of a scattered fashion. So put into a database so those data can be analyzed and recommendations can come from that. And oftentimes, with a watershed plan and working with a lake association, there are recommendations during that 12 to 18 months that I talked about where we recommend increasing monitoring to get more data. For example, taking a sediment sample to kind of learn what's in those sediments, or maybe testing a little bit more frequently during the summer, or maybe extending your season out. Not a surprise, but the more data you have, the better your plan is going to be and the better all your modeling is going to be. And then probably my favorite part, because I love the outdoors, is what I call the boots on the ground part of a survey. And this is where you visually go out and see and document the erosion sites or other types of problems that might be happening. Maybe there's an issue at a boat launch, you have unstable culverts. You document that. We often find 50 to 100 sites in a lake watershed that need fixing. We also, in the plans that we assist on, we do a shoreline survey where we ride along with the Lake Association and volunteers who know the lake really well, and we do a shoreline assessment of the lake because you get a much different view of the lake from the water looking to the shore than you do from, riding the camp roads or riding around in the watershed. So it's important to do both. And again, it's all an educational opportunity. And the picture on the left, again, we'll bring volunteers and stakeholders in the field and, explain, the science that we've learned over these last decades and how it can help your lake. A big part of that big price tag that I mentioned is the modeling, right? So usually when you do a watershed plan, it's the first time or maybe the first time in a long time that a really in-depth scientific look at your lake has been done. And the model, without going into too much detail, because again, that could be a whole nother presentation, but a model, you're modeling the phosphorus and other pollutants that are going from the land into your lake. So you really need to get a good sense of what's coming off the land and measuring, quantifying that impact on your lake and how it's affecting water quality. And I've mentioned phosphorus, but chloride, salt, is another big issue that we're going to keep hearing more about in New Hampshire lakes as the salt from the roads gets into the groundwater and makes its way in. So that's an example of another pollutant that is often addressed in these plans. So a build out analysis. So you look at the past, you look at the past, present, and future in the lake when you're doing this model, as we call it. The past is what did the lake look like with no development? What was the water quality? And again, it's a model, right? So it's not perfect, but you have good data to make a good guess. The present is kind of the easy part, right? Because most lakes have, 20, 30, sometimes more years of data, and you can go out on the land and, in that year or 18 months, get a really good sense of what's happening. The other part of it, which is so important, is a build out analysis. So you're actually projecting future growth in your watershed. So this is an example of Swansea Lake, and the black buildings on the left are existing development. But when you look at the zoning and the population growth rates in the watershed, all those red dots on the map on the right show you what the lake could look like in 50 years or 60 years. And that's really important to understand, because there are usually things you can do for your lake. Maybe you have a special natural resources overlay zone where you want to limit development a little bit so that those problems that you're having don't get worse. That's just an example. There are lots of other things you can do as well. And a watershed plan really gets into that detail. So we also kind of estimate, like, your phosphorus levels are like this now in 2025, but here with this development is what what they might be in 2070. And some of these maps that we do, because it's a growing area, this might not be the best example, but there are red dots everywhere. It really can be an eye opener to see how much development could occur in your watershed. The water quality goal I touched on a little bit already. And so that's, setting that numeric piece that's required by the state of New Hampshire. It's required by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that funds some of these plans and approves these plans. So that's a really important piece. It's not a big time piece of a watershed plan, but a lot of the work that goes into those other four categories is kind of building up to this numeric number. And then again, the action plan and the final WMP is watershed management plan. And that's, again, who's gonna help fix the lake? Where do you need to do the fixes? How much is it gonna help your lake? How much do you need to do to help your lake? How much is that gonna cost? That's what goes into an action plan. And we often write those action plans with direct input from all the stakeholders, because again, your watersheds better than we do. A lot of people really know the history really well, and that's really important, because sometimes historical sources of pollutants can get into the sediments in the bottom of the lake and sit there. And then you have basically a chemical reaction that when you lose oxygen in the bottom of the lake, you have a release of phosphorus from the bottom sediments. We call that internal loading. And we've worked on lakes where there was like a big farming community and just lots of high test runoff happening for decades. And so the sediments were still kind of hot, for lack of a better word. And that was part of the problem that had to be dealt with. And yes, it does make it more complicated. Okay, so about 10 slides left. I wanted to just show, a lot of you are lakeshore landowners. I can't give a slideshow without sharing some of these. And I wanted to just show that the grants that are out there, that once you have a watershed plan, you can get implementation money, we call it, or money to fix things. And that can even be done on private land. And there's a lot, that's kind of rare, I think, where, federal grant money or state grant money can help fix your property. There's a little bit of a catch to it. Usually as a landowner, you contribute 50%, but hey, that's not bad. And I like these pictures because these are all lake protection practices that all, they're, I think, aesthetically pleasing. You can fix things up and make them look a lot nicer as well. And again, it's pretty hard to get from the house on the left to the house on the right. But if we're doing our shoreline survey, the house on the right is going to get a better lake protection score. The house on the left, we're going to have a lot of recommendations for doing plantings along the lake shore. And again, landowners have so much power to make a difference for the lake's health. I mentioned death by 1,000 cuts or 1,000 paper cuts, and really, educating yourselves to learn what can be done. There's a lot of really good resources out there. And again, these are just more pictures of rain gardens or planting shrubs, mowing your lawn at 3 inches instead of 1.5 inches actually makes a positive difference for your lake. Okay, so now I'm going to share just a few lessons learned. These are actually, I took these from a slideshow I gave in Wolfboro a couple of years ago where they asked me to, hey, you've been doing this work for 25 years. What can you tell us? What wisdom have you gained? And I thought this would be a good group to share just a couple thoughts with. And I've already hit on this already, but that local leadership is really important. And the most successful projects often have a local champion, or better yet, many local champions that are going to be there for 3 years, 5 years, 10 or 15 years to kind of see this type of work through. And then having a really diverse stakeholder group and engaging your towns, right? The towns are really important. The public works that fix the roads, like roads are a big problem. And they might not be able to help you with, replacing septic systems, but there's a lot municipalities can do, and they often are the groups that receive the grants. So make friends with your town if you haven't already. Communication, I think this is a more obvious one, but the Lake Winnipesaukee now it's Alliance, the Keep Winnie Blue themes. I think messaging is so important in this day and age of social media, right? Everybody gets so much of their information and news from these sources. So in the lake world and in the watershed planning world, we need to have really good, strong visuals and simple messages that aren't too complicated. And then, I showed you those slides earlier, and there's another one on the left of the soil erosion. And, that might be new to you folks, some of you folks on the call. Like, was that really a big deal? It's just dirt. But no, what we've learned over time is the sediment and therefore the phosphorus that's in the soil can make it into this little ditch, into the stream, and then the view on the right, the stream outlets to the lake. And look at that delta. That's a delta of sediment that's happening. And we've seen lakes where those deltas have increased over 5 years. They've grown much bigger because there's been a lot of clearing upstream. And those are the sorts of things that it's good to know about, but that a watershed plan can really focus on or hone in on. And I mentioned septic systems. I don't think we can talk about lakes too much without really, you have to pay special attention when we do our analyses for a watershed plan. We're always looking at septic systems, and we're again having a database to be able to track when a system has been put in or updated is really important, because generally speaking, the old systems can be pretty bad and they can be failing under the ground, and it's kind of hard to figure that out. And the technology is getting better, but it's not there yet. So a lot of it's just pump outs and ordinances and education. And then I guess one more important note is that, right, so this is evolving. Like, I'm sitting giving this presentation, in 2025. Again, a decade ago in 2015, we knew a lot less than we knew now about cyanobacteria, about how our lakes respond, about how the different, critters in the lake, the food web responds, and also about fixing lakes and what can be done. whether it's a certain kind of treatment or maybe more importantly, the fixes that need to be done to your watershed, or we call them BMPs, or best management practices. So just remember that science is evolving, and we're going to know a lot more in 5 years than we know now, which is another good reason, to update your watershed plan. All right, I'm right on time. This is good. So I wanted to spend 3 or 4 minutes on this last slide, and that's funding. So I gave you the scary price tag, and wanted to just reiterate, to think big. A watershed plan, might cost that much, but it often costs a few $1 million, right, to fix a lake. So it's sort of a drop in the bucket. And again, you have to have a watershed plan to apply for most grants. Not all grants, but for the most part, you do. And even if it wasn't required, if you didn't have one, I think, the most of the funders would say, well, get a plan, do the analysis, and come back to us in 2 years. So yeah, your lake is worth it. Um, there are multiple kinds of sources. New Hampshire is pretty unique, at least in New England, from my experience, where you have on the upper right the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So there's actually over $1 million a year in the stormwater planning part of this, what we call CWSRF. And watershed plans are a big part of that. And they're actually considered loans, but the loans have 100% forgiveness. So it has to go to a town. It can't go to a lake association, but usually the interest on that loan is $1,000 or $2,000. So it's very, very minimal what the community would have to pay. And that's through the state of New Hampshire. And most of those are state funds. So even with the shrinking of some federal funds, this program remains strong. And Deb Loisel is a wonderful resource, and her team at New Hampshire DES. They are great partners for New Hampshire lakes, and I think they deserve awards for how much they've done. It's been really amazing. There's also 319 and 604B funds, and I know I'm throwing numbers at you, but those are parts of the Clean Water Act that the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, gives funds, grants funds to all the states every year, and then the states distribute those monies to a lake association, to a town. But those are unique because if you're a nonprofit 501c3, you can receive those funds, unlike the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I know that's all confusing, but there are also private sources. NIFWIF, well, actually, NIFWIF is not private, but they do get some federal funds, but it's a kind of a different animal. And I guess the message there is that there are other opportunities, and lake associations have been saving their money, and in a lot of cases, either partially funding a plan or even fully funding a watershed plan over the last decade. Sometimes it's because they have some donors that they're able to tap into. Maybe there's a camp on the lake that sees the problem and is are willing to kick in a good amount of money to keep that resource strong and keep their business moving. So there are lots of opportunities, and there's the state is available to help you, and we also help with grant writing and some of those kind of daunting pieces. So I've left 15 minutes for some great questions. So my phone number and email is there for you to take down. If we don't get to your questions, feel free to reach out directly, and myself or Laura, whose picture I showed, one of us will get back to you as soon as we can. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Forrest. That was a really great in-depth presentation regarding watershed management plans. So thank you so much for coming and joining us and speaking. while I go through these questions, I think we're going to start with some of the more bigger, complex questions that might come about that would be helpful for Forrest to answer now while he's on call for everyone. But about municipalities, town engagement, funding, any of those questions. So I'm going to start at the top of what I can find there. So we have a question from Bill Johnson about how can we motivate all the towns within a watershed district or multiple towns in multiple districts to combine best management practices in zoning and building codes to more closely regulate development in the watersheds.
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, Bill, and like a multifaceted one to answer. So I'll give kind of a broad answer. I will say that the watershed management plan is often used as the vehicle to get those conversations started. It doesn't have to be. You can obviously have them otherwise, but the value of a watershed plan is that you have data. You know, here's our lake. Here's the declining trend. This is the resource. We often call lakes like a local industry, right? Because in New Hampshire, like, why do people go to Holderness? They go there for Squam Lakes, right? And so really just kind of emphasizing to the towns that the economic base, right? It's like, economics and the environment shouldn't be a battle. It should be a balance, right? And so you can use the watershed management plan to hold the meetings, which is part of the process to start those discussions. And if they're frank discussions, I think those are often the best discussions. And in a year to 18 months, you can usually work through a lot of that.
Great. Another follow-up from Bill is how specifically do you get with watershed management plans incorporated in each town's codes?
Really good question. In codes might be difficult, but what we often do is we recommend that the towns adopt the watershed management plan or that they incorporate the watershed management plan into their master plan or comprehensive plan. So at least it's referred to as part of that. So those are the most common ways, but usually as part of a watershed plan, ordinance recommendations it's a big part of the action plan. So there might be 6 recommended ordinances, that are prioritized for that water body. And they're usually unique depending on that water body's problems. Great questions.
Great. Another one about MS4 plan. So Thomas Steen asked, how does or how can a town's MS4 plan support the watershed management plan for a lake that's in the town's watershed?
Yeah, so another great question, and I think I think what the MS4 does is that it raises the bar, right? So MS4 for everybody that's listening is municipal stormwater systems and the impacts on the lakes. So I can think of an example in Maine that we're working on, and the town is able, the watershed plan and that process, the town is more involved because they get credit for the MS4, for the work that's being done in the plan, because it's addressing the stormwater issues and protecting the resource. So I think that's the most common. The other piece with the MS4s is there's often better data to pull from. Maybe they've mapped their whole stormwater system. And so, the boots on the ground work can be much easier to do because you have better data.
Great. So I have like kind of a two-parter from John Beef. We have why do some of these towns care about a plan if they are not on a lake? And a follow-up to that is like, why should a town invest? And I think wanting to know for the want and need to know for buy-in.
Yeah, yeah. These are all such great questions. A very educated group. So, full transparency, it's been a challenge, right? You have a watershed and there's 5 towns. 2 are on the shoreline, 3 are uphill, if you will, or further out in the watershed. I think in most cases, it's been hard to engage those towns. One of we've tried to use the carrot more than the stick, and really tried, grant money is available for your town, a watershed plan, and the people working on the plan are going to help raise money to fix things that help this resource. And I think the messaging is, like I mentioned, the lakes are your industry. If you're, not on Lake Winnipesaukee, or you're 2 towns away, I mean, that resource is still so important in so many ways for your town, and just reminding them of that. But again, fair question, and oftentimes it's the lakes with the shoreline that end up doing more.
Another kind of two-parter from Tom and John. Tom's original thought and comment was the concern against not having enough funding for 319 grants for 2026. And John kind of offered that fiscal restraint and how much money will actually be available to support an action plan. And this might not be something that you can fully answer, but
Yeah, no, great question. And one of the reasons I pointed to that clean water SRF is because I think that's a really good alternate source. I think 319 money, so that's money to fix problems, is generally in New Hampshire been about, I think, about 750,000. So that's not a lot to go across the state. But the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, even though it's technically a loan, has a lot bigger dollars to do more. So and so there's assessment funds under this Clean Water State Revolving Funds, and they also have stormwater implementation funds. And I didn't really use this word stormwater too much, but that's such a big part of it. The watershed runoff is stormwater. So there are ways to address it, but oftentimes municipalities are asked to contribute, and I didn't mention that much, but Lake Canasatka, the town of Moultonborough kicked in $60,000 for the watershed plan when the citizens, went to the select board and budget committee, and we've seen that happen, dozens of times as well. And oftentimes the argument is like, hey, a lot of your tax base is here on this lake. So that sometimes perks their ears up.
awesome. Nancy Ricker had a question. Do you have an estimate cost for updating a watershed management plan?
Yeah, really good question. Of course, it's that annoying answer of it depends. It depends on how old the plan is. If it's 20 years old, there's really not much in there that's going to be of use, a little bit. So, but if it's, 10 years old, I think that's a little different. And again, it's such a case by case basis of, well, maybe you did a plan, but was it an effective plan? How much was implemented, and how much data, did you have that went into the plan? One of the challenges, not to go too far down a rabbit hole, is that if you have an older plan, the water quality data is going to be all new, like in that last decade, and that new data and what those data tell us are really going to dictate the plan, and they often tell you something different than they did 10 or 20 years ago. So that's an important factor. So yeah, hard to give a number. Is it less to update a plan? Sometimes yes, sometimes it's just not.
Great. Anne McKay asks, should an existing watershed management plan prevent development within that plan? And if yes, how is it implemented with the town and presented plans?
So I assume that means
I think that
residential development. Yeah, yeah. So again, really good question. The messaging that, I've always been careful to use is, not to restrict development, but develop intelligently and develop carefully. And a lot of it really comes down to the ordinance part of it, right? The ordinances are pretty amazing, and we've gotten to work on a bunch because you can write an ordinance as a consultant for, I don't know, $10,000, which, is obviously a lot less than a watershed plan. And the impacts can be pretty far reaching from that ordinance as far as, how much bang you get for the buck. And land protection, I haven't really mentioned land protection, but that's such a big part. And I've been on land trust boards for a lot of my life and career. And I think, again, that's a lot of bang for the buck. If you have a local or regional land trust that you can collaborate with and coordinate with and protect some of that land from development, it is such a high value. And I've seen just a lot of success stories with big parcels that have, been purchased or donated, and really made a difference in watersheds.
Great. I know we only have we have about 4 minutes left here, so I'm going to get through a couple smaller questions that we didn't get to. And again, if we didn't get to your question today, feel free to reach out to New Hampshire Lakes if you have any additional questions for us. And again, Forrest information, he will be available for questions and follow up. And again, this recording will be sent out to you as well, so you'll have that information in this presentation. But quick question from Sue Higgins. Most roads around our lake are gravel. Is there a better material to use?
Oh, wow. Yeah, another great question. So, it's generally better to use a material that packs better for a while. 15 or 20 years ago, we were often recommending what we call reclaim or recycled asphalt because it packed a little better. But I think there's not as much available now for different reasons, so that's a little tricky. It's really, gravel roads are treatable. If they have a good crown and the water can sheet off and there's a little bit of a ditch on the side, or there's ways that the runoff goes into the woods and not your lake, you can actually do a lot for not a high cost on these gravel roads. I will say there have been times, not a lot, but some where it's been such a steep slope and it just becomes the road becomes a stream during a thunderstorm, and some areas have paved a little area, and of course with that pavement, you don't want to really pave watersheds, but if you can control all that runoff and you have the space to work with, then it can be effective.
Great. I'll have
That's a
one
great
more
answer.
yeah, it is.
Mhm.
One more really quick question from Charles Crespi of what your interpretation of a really old septic system would be.
Well, that's a great question. Pre-1972, right? So a lot of the septic codes were, the state codes and came in about that time. So the standards increased, since then. So new systems, the technology has often gotten much better. We worked on Lake Wentworth in near Winnipesaukee and Wolfboro, and we had a lot of systems that were 1910, 1915. Those were definitely old systems that needed some love.
Awesome. Well, as we're reaching the 1 minute mark, thank you so much, Forrest, for presenting for us. Fantastic presentation, and thank you all for joining us. Again, if you have any questions that you were burning and didn't get to ask or didn't get answered, Forrest's information will be available, as well as if you want to give a call to New Hampshire Lakes office, we will also be happy to answer any questions. But okay, well, Bria, if you have anything else to add, but thank you guys. This has really been a great night, so appreciate it. And
Thank you,
we'll get
everybody.
back to you with a link to the recording. Thank you, Forrest.
You bet.
Bye, everyone.